So you know that I love the book. I really thought it was an amazing book, Ilana, and it resonated with me in a very personal way on so many levels, which we discussed. I almost felt like you were telling my story as well. I mean, we both grew up in what was known as the modern Orthodox world. We both attended yeshiva day schools and yeshiva high schools. I guess I was a little bit more fortunate than you because Meir Kahana and Baruch Goldstein did not attend my yeshiva high school. We attended the same Zionist youth movement, B'nai Akiva. We both went to the same overnight camp, in the Poconos, Camp Moshava. We both ended up at Barnard College, though not the same years, and that's why our paths never crossed. And I just learned something else that we both share. We both have 4 kids. So we've got a lot in common. And I guess maybe the most important thing that we have in common is that we both rebelled against our upbringing. And I think that's pretty rare among immigrants who I know, and you probably know, it's not a very typical thing for those who grew up the way we grew up with our backgrounds to rebel in this way. And I think both religiously and politically. So I just wanted to talk about a few of the insights in your book that really spoke to me. And you mentioned before the school WhatsApp group, which was a story, an anecdote that I love that is in the introduction to your book. And you remember my interview with you. And the story that was eventually published, I led with that because I thought it really said so much about the book, that experience and what brought you to write that book. But like you, I'm in a number of these WhatsApp groups, both a high school one and a college alumni WhatsApp group with many of the same people from my past, from the Orthodox Jewish world, mainly in the United States. And I think they're a great way, these groups are a great way of seeing where people's heads are at. Most of the people in these groups, unlike us, they still live in America. And for the most part, I would say that they haven't moved on. They're still somewhat stuck in the 70s, like your school teacher from your yeshiva high school in Brooklyn was and is. For them, Israel can do no wrong. For them, any criticism of Israel's actions is anti-Semitism. For them, God gave the land of Israel to the Jews, and anyone else who wants to live on this land must do so as more or less a second-class citizen. Many of them see nothing wrong with people like Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir. And in fact, if they had the right to vote, they probably would have voted for them in the last election. As you wisely noted in your book, to understand Ben-Gvir and what's happening in Israel now, you have to understand Brooklyn, the place you came from. In other words, you need to understand the environment where his mentor was raised, that mentor being Meir Kahana. And as you rightly observed in the book, that ideology has unfortunately found its way into Israeli society, especially in recent years. And I would not be surprised if, in fact, many of the people who voted for Ben-Gvir in the last election are some Orthodox Jews from the West Bank who came originally from Brooklyn. And as you know, there are many of them. So I don't know about you, Ilana, but I haven't left any of these WhatsApp groups because I'm kind of fascinated in a weird way with the discourse that goes on in there. But I obviously don't engage because I've reached the conclusion that it's pointless. And also, I'm a reporter, so I'm not supposed to share my opinions, even though I'm doing a little of that right now. So you talked, you just recently talked about the exchange you had with that friend of yours, or former friend, who was an administrator of the WhatsApp group, who kind of said to you, don't you know what's going on in Israel? And that, I get that as well a lot. Like, Judy, don't you know what's going on in Israel? And I can say that, no, not only do I live here, not only have my kids served in the army here, not only do I pay taxes here, but I actually have been my entire life a news reporter here. So I definitely know what's going on. And, when you get those comments, it makes you wonder, where are these people getting their information from? I have some ideas, but we can talk about that later. But, where do they get some ideas that are so detached from the reality in this country, and feel so confident about what they're saying? The other thing that really struck me about your book, and I've also experienced this as well, especially in America, you wrote in there about how deeply Jewish Americans were affected by October 7th. Now, obviously, that's to be expected because it was such a catastrophe, as we constantly say, the worst single-day massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But it happened in Israel. It didn't happen in the United States. And what fascinates me in a way is sometimes you get the feeling that American Jews actually feel like they lived through it more so than the Israelis who did. And I don't know how to explain it, but I know you wrote about it, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. But in general, I want to say that your book got me thinking a lot about what has happened to the religious Zionist community in America, and what made it move so much to the right, both religiously and politically. And by the way, this has happened in Israel as well, but I think for somewhat different reasons. So I'm a few years older than you, Ilana, but I think that a lot that changed happened between the years that the two of us were in high school. When I went to Barnard, the school was pretty much half Jewish. And in Columbia, when I was there, Columbia was still all male. It was very common to see boys walking around with kippot on their heads. It was basically the go-to school for kids from yeshiva day schools from around the metropolitan New York area. Now, I spent a lot of time at Columbia last year covering the protests there. And one thing that stood out to me was how few visibly Jewish kids there were on campus, at least compared to the years when I was there. It was very, very different. So what happened? Here's my theory. When I was a kid in Bnei Akiva, the movement was very different. This was there before there was much of a settlement movement in Israel. Before there were places like Efrat or Ma'ale Adumim, the dream of every Bnei Akiva graduate at that time was to make Aliyah and move to a religious kibbutz. And at the time, it was very common for boys and girls to do Israeli folk dances together, holding hands. The girls wore shorts in camp, up to their knees, but still it was shorts. We went swimming together, boys and girls. And even the married women who were on staff at the camp, none of them covered their hair. So what I think happened is that Jewish parents got scared. They got scared of intermarriage because once they started sending their kids off to non-Jewish colleges, what inevitably happened was that they would meet non-Jews and sometimes fall in love with them. And this was, at least when I was in college, it was the famous period of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And Orthodox Jewish parents were terrified that their kids would get involved in those things. So they started building walls around them, walls to prevent them from interacting with non-Jews and even non-Orthodox Jews. And these were walls to prevent them from being exposed to any temptations of the outside world. So the rules of kashrut got stricter, the rules of Shabbat got stricter. Many parents stopped sending their kids to schools like Columbia, and instead they sent them to Yeshiva University and Stern College, where they wouldn't have to test their so-called Yetzer Hara. So, and when I was in high school, it was very common, I assume this was the case in other yeshiva high schools at the time, that in your senior year, you went to a kibbutz for a few months. That doesn't exist anymore. Now, what has become the rite of passage for kids in yeshiva day schools, high schools, to spend a year either in yeshiva or a seminary. So the whole Orthodox world has become more and more insulated. And even though the community you and I grew up in was called modern Orthodox, there's much less of the modern in it anymore. The original idea had been that you can lead an Orthodox lifestyle and still be a person of the world and be part of the outside world. I think that over the past few decades, that has become less and less the case. And along with this gravitation toward the right religiously, we've seen that same gravitation toward the right politically.
So, when you were talking before you said the word fear, what was going through my mind was fear. What's different, what's the difference between being able to see a sort of humane vision and giving yourself permission to not bother with that humane vision is fear. Because if you're full of that fear, then, you're in survival mode on a certain, level, and then you don't have to bother with humanity, empathy, compassion. And
Mhm.
so I feel like the Jewish world has, Jewish identity, Jewish culture has always vacillated between these two perspectives, from a perspective of vision of who we are as a people in the world versus a vision of fear. And the problem is that we have a lot of leaders, Jewish leaders, and also in the rest of the world, who like it better when people are fearful. Because when people are fearful, they tend to vote more to the right. They tend to be, less demanding about things like compassionate policies and more, ready to do some really awful things. I mean, that's sort of like human nature. There's actually a line about it in House of Cards. One of the cliffhangers in one season from House of Cards is where you hear Kevin Spacey says, "Oh, fear? We can do fear." Like that's his last line. We can do fear, as if to say fear is this thing that a political leader can use in order to get compliance, basically compliance. And I feel like that has often been cynically used by some of our current Israeli leaders. Some of our current Israeli leaders have been doing this for a very long time. And the problem is that October 7th fed into all of that. October 7th became like Exhibition A. You see, the whole world hates Jews and all of that. So October 7th became, sort of molded into this like very, gross 3,000 year narrative instead of being about the here and now and real people. So anyway, yeah, I totally agree with your analysis. And also one other thing that I wanted to say is it's interesting that when you talk about the fear that entered sort of modern religious life, the fears have to do with gender, actually. Almost all your examples had to do with gender. Like, oh my God, boys and girls are holding hands. Oh my God, girls are dressing a certain way. So it's like a lot of the fear has to do with loss of patriarchal power, right? It has to do with the fear that, oh my God, women are going to like change things, and then, the patriarchy will have less. So I feel like these things are also connected. I mean, maybe that's a subject for a whole other book,
I
but
didn't think about it, but you're right.
all your
That's
examples were gendered.
Yeah.
They were all gender
Mhm.
examples. Anyway, thank you, Judy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're gonna come back to you. Now we're going to hear from, hang on, we're going to hear now from Becca Strober. So let me just introduce Becca. You might follow Becca on Instagram and social media under Becca Explains the Occupation. That's this Becca, the famous Becca of Becca Explains the Occupation. Becca is an American Israeli based in Israel and has dedicated over a decade to educating diverse communities about the mechanics of occupation, about working to combat misinformation by providing clear, well-sourced information. And Becca's extensive experience includes roles as senior director at Breaking the Silence and a whole bunch of other organizations. And Becca has a really interesting backstory too. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. So I was thinking, I thought a bit when I was reading the book what I want to talk about, and then also right now listening to Judy talk, because I was also thinking a lot about that initial conversation that you had on WhatsApp, and the kind of leader of the WhatsApp group messaging you personally and saying, I'm worried about you. Maybe you should go back to being a grandma. As the person who's actually in the country and dealing with these questions and dealing with these realities quite seriously, I know also to say for myself, October 7th was, of course, one of the scariest days of my life. I live near the airport. So very, very early on, from the very first moment that there were sirens here. We were desperately trying to figure out how to get a friend out of the south, who luckily in the end was unharmed. Hamas did not make it to the kibbutz that he was on, but they very well could have, and it was a very big, a very real fear in the moment. And my partner's mom also grew up on a kibbutz in the area, and trying to figure out, who is okay and what's going on, and kind of the frenzy also of information that day. For me, that was the day that I went back onto Twitter after years of being off of it, because that was the only place where you could find information. And I generally have a lot of critique of the Israeli media, but that was probably one of the days where you could really see the panic in the reporters' voices. And they were reporting from what they were hearing from people in the kibbutzes and near the party, and not the opposite. The army wasn't telling them what to say. They were telling the army what to do. And if I can't imagine more of a loss of control than what we felt at that moment. And I also, of course, got a lot of messages from people afterwards. You said that I think we all felt a lot of fear, or just we're quite quieted in those first weeks and months after October 7th from speaking out. And I know that personally affected me a lot. I was really afraid to speak my mind those first days, those first weeks, those first months. But when I did, people also started asking me, I got a lot of similar conversations. And what I think is interesting is that, obviously, so I'm 36, so I'm a millennial. I grew up in Philly. Part of my family's from Jerusalem, so I've always been in Israel back and forth, but I moved here permanently in 2007. So I've been here for half my life. My kid has not served in the army. He's only 5 weeks old, and I hope he never will. But I myself did serve in the army from 2008 and 2010, and I was a shooting instructor. And I spent some time during my service in the West Bank. And what I think is interesting when I read through your book was you were talking about this Jewish Orthodox experience from, a generation or two above mine. And the experience that I grew up in was much more of a progressive, reform Jewish community. The community that I grew up in always spoke of peace, always spoke of the two-state solution, always spoke of progressive politics. And yet so much of the examples are very, very similar. Even though that when you look at them politically, probably also in US politics, though I'm in no way an expert on the Orthodox community in America, but are really, I think, very far away from each other on a bunch of different, life experiences inside the US. But when it comes to this question of Israel, are actually quite similar. Except I think that with the community that I grew up in and the community that I work with quite regularly now, meaning the more, progressive reform movement Jewish community who I do a lot of work with educating on the occupation, believe that they are having the moral conversation, believe that they're seeing the reality, believe that they are taking the other side into account. And practically, when I was growing up, I think I was 17, I was actually on a program in Israel through the reform movement. And I'd grown up my whole entire life being told that we believe in the two-state solution. It was said in my house, it was said in my synagogue, it was said in the camp that I went to. We believe in the two-state solution. I was only 17 when I actually finally saw a map with the green line and Gaza on it. I had no idea up until that moment what the other state was supposed to be. And I remember feeling a really, kind of like major ping of loss from seeing the map. Oh, we're supposed to give all of that up. And I look to the American Jewish community today, to the progressive American Jewish community today. And on one hand, 20 years has passed since I had that experience personally. And you have seen some political change in the American Jewish world, right? You do have also Jewish American progressive movements that exist right now, by the way, who often exist in the wake of wars in Gaza, right? Like, if not now, started as a group who was saying the Kaddish for civilians who had died in Gaza in 2014, right? That was like how the movement had started. But that you still have US Jewish institutions who actually haven't really they haven't made much progress in terms of being able to have an actual political conversation about what's going on, about the rights of two people to live here, about what the occupation is, about the fact that there's military control. And so also a lot of my friends and people who I've just connected with since October 7th, it was interesting, Judy, you said that you feel that American Jews almost somehow felt October 7th like more personally, even though it happened to us and we were the ones who were here. I felt that same exact experience. I've even met a lot of Jews in the US who now call themselves October 7th or October 8th Jews, meaning October 7th was actually the thing that woke them up into their Judaism. And I think not unlike the core of the Judaism that I grew up with, it wasn't a religious Judaism, right? That's not to say that Reform Judaism doesn't have its religious aspects. We absolutely did, but so much of our connection to Judaism is through Israel, right? I came to Israel when I was 17 on the Reform Movement's program. Talking about the kibbutzes, Judy, that perhaps in your generation you went on, back in the day, we do those trips to Israel. And on one hand, we're not necessarily sitting in settlements and we're not necessarily, hearing Smotrich's talking points about annexation. But on the other hand, we're not talking at all about the reality as to what is going on. And I think October 7th really pushed that reality even farther, and I experienced it personally. The first time that I guarded a settlement in my Army service, it was, I think, probably in 2009. And I remember just guarding a settlement in the northern part of the West Bank, and there was no fence around the West Bank. And we're like a few soldiers who are there, and we don't have our commander nearby because there's other soldiers on other settlements, and that's kind of how it works. And so the person you're really getting commands from is this civilian security coordinator on the settlement who's supposed to be dealing with the security of the settlement exclusively, but they themselves, of course, have a political goal. And he was the one telling us where to stand. He was the one telling us, if you see the Arab village, Palestinian village, but he said Arab village, that's 150, 250 meters away from us. If you see the Arabs go down into the valley, you have to go kick them out, even though you could clearly see that the valley was their agricultural land, right? And I remember this settlement didn't have a fence around it, and now I spend every week. I'm in the West Bank, and a lot of settlements don't have fences around them. That's a very, very common practice. But at the time, it surprised me, and I said, "Well, why don't you put a fence around the settlement, and it'll be so much easier for us as soldiers to guard it." It was such an innocent question, because I joined the army in order to protect the security of Israelis. And he said, he kind of looked around at this one Palestinian village and all the other Palestinian villages, more like farther away. And he looked around, he said, because all of this is ours.
So, that's really interesting. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, and just, I remember in that moment when I was probably 19 or 20 thinking, oh, okay, I'm upholding a political mission right now. That's my job right now. And I think I spent the rest of my army service training soldiers and sometimes guarding settlements, but I very specifically remember walking away from that moment thinking, American Jews don't get that. No one told this to me. We don't understand it. That we don't understand it. Oh, is this the protecting of Israel that I was taught about in synagogue, that I was taught about in Hebrew school? I went to public school, but that I was taught about in Hebrew school at camp. And I remember going back to my synagogue after guarding that settlement. I mean, when I was in the army, and going to my synagogue for prayers on I think it was Friday night, and afterwards, the rabbi told everyone that, oh, I was coming back from the army and I was a soldier, and everyone like stood up one by one and thanked me for my service. Like 40 people shook my hand. And no one asked me what I was doing, right? The details of it. And I think that post October 7th, this has become that situation, but, times 100. It's become that situation on steroids, where you have a lot of the American Jewish community who are having a discourse about Israel, but Israel is not part of the discourse, right? I mean, Israel is not part of the actual conversation. And what I mean is that a lot of the conversation, a lot of people I talk to base their political opinions on Israel right now, based on what students in a campus like Columbia, what signs they're holding at a protest, right? Now, that's obviously a relevant conversation to have in terms of Jewish safety in the US, in terms of political messaging, in terms of having a wider camp of who's considered to be on the left, who's considered to be progressive, what do progressive voices include. Those are all really relevant conversations, but they don't actually have to do with the fact that Israel is and has been since day one purposefully been limiting aid into Gaza. And you can use Israel's military data to show that, right? And it doesn't change the fact that Israel increased the amount of civilians that it's willing to kill for lower and lower Hamas members by the tens than what it was willing to do in 2014, which was an increased number from 2008. And it doesn't look into the reality. So many people have messaged me on this Instagram, amongst other places, but also an in-person, of course, education that I do, and have said, Jews just want to live in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank. We just want to live there. Why can't we do that? And, I don't understand the reality that in order to make that happen, that, security head of that settlement who wants to kick out all of those Arab villages and ethnically cleanse parts of the West Bank, he's doing that right now. I mean, as we speak, over 50 communities in the West Bank have been ethnically cleansed in full, have been kicked out because of settler violence in full. And that settler violence is military backed.
I feel like you and I have been like on sort of parallel tracks a little bit. I feel like your story of like being at the center of it and then like unpacking what you're really doing, even though you and I come from like very different places and we're sort of different official generations, this process of like unpacking all of these messages that we were given. It's like really hard work, and you're coming up against things in yourself, and you're also coming up against things in your community. And one of the things that's really resonating with me with what you're describing is I feel like there's two Israels right now. There's Israel, the actual Israel, what Israel is actually doing as a nation among 180 nations of the world, actual power as an authority, a sovereign country, versus Israel, the symbol. Jews around the world has Israel as a symbol for a long time, and that Israel as a symbol is there in, everyday prayers and all kinds of, pictures on the walls and places to go when you want to go on vacation or whatever. But, and now, even more, Israel is the symbol of some kind of like safe haven. So again, it gets back to that fear thing. So Americans are feeling, Jews around the world, not just Americans, also Canadians and Australians, Australians are having a really hard time right now, So Jews around the world are living in some actual real fears. And so Israel is not about what Israel actually is, but it's about some kind of like imaginary symbol or icon that makes people feel better. So like I've had a lot of really strange conversations with Jews from around the world coming to Israel because they think, oh, they're coming to Israel to feel safe. And I'm sort of like, well, Israel is not necessarily safer right now than you may feel like, the Upper West Side of Manhattan is not a safe place because, but technically speaking, there are a lot of risks in Israel, but Jews are still coming to Israel because it's that symbol of whatever it is that they want to feel when they're feeling afraid. And so those are two very different things. And it's like they're across, so when you're living in that fear with Israel as the symbol, you can't question that. There's too much at stake. Like, it's like, oh my God, don't question all that. Don't question what Bibi Netanyahu is doing. Don't, upend that. So that's really hard. I've been finding that to be really hard. What about you? I mean, you're on social media all the time. Like, you're right. You're in the middle of all of this on social media, having these really hard conversations. What's that like?
Yeah. It's difficult. I really try and bring the conversation down into into the reality and to stuff that's happening on the ground, and to bring it away from what I think is happening often in the US, which is this kind of like a conversation on a discourse on an academic topic. Settler colonialism. Yes or no, right? Understanding if it is or isn't settler colonialism doesn't necessarily get us any closer to understanding how do we protect communities in Area C of the West Bank, Palestinian communities. Why are they being pushed out? And what's the role of the international community? What's the role of Israelis? And what's the role of the Jewish communities abroad, right? So I really want to bring it to the ground. What I think is most interesting that I find that the American Jewish community struggles with, and I will say I really genuinely think even American Jews who are more to the right, and October 7th pushed them more to the right, and there are many, those who were pushed more to open up, ask questions, want to find a solution, want to find real solutions so that two peoples, can have self-determination between the river to the sea. There are those people as well. Also in Israel, by the way, most of the work I do with it is with Israelis, like in person. The conversations with young Israelis have gotten so much easier. You couldn't convince an 18-year-old Israeli 3 years ago, taking them on a tour in Hebron where Palestinians can't walk outside of their front door for 20 years. You couldn't convince an 18-year-old in Israel that it mattered to them. Couldn't convince them. Now they get that it matters. And I think with the American Jewish community, back to this part of fear, which I think is really interesting, is that American Jews really understand how a robust democratic society has helped us in America, how civil rights are important in America, how American Jewish communities have been able to thrive because of minority rights, because of a strong democracy. That same principle, people don't want in Israel, including American Jews. Now, progressive American Jews will say they want it because because it's something that we, on the progressive side, in the reform movement and in the communities that I grew up in, it's part of our identity. We have to believe that. But when you ask people about it further, right, people want to maintain the status as it is. They want a state that holds Jewish power. That's, a Kahana Ben Gvir concept that holds Jewish power, that allows us to escape to a place where we are the power. And it's completely opposite of what we want in America. In America, we want a robust democracy to keep us safe. And I think that when you talk to the American Jewish progressive community, that's where I find, in the thrust of it, like in Instagram, that people cannot reconcile these two realities. The thing that we believe is inherent in the US to all people is not in Israel. In Israel, we want that, what we feel is a safety net, right? But really it's power, it's control, it's state apparatus that are privileging Jewish people over Palestinians, throughout the river to the sea. May it be in Israel or in occupied territory, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's a super interesting analysis, Becca. Super interesting. And that's a good segue for us to our next speaker. Thank you, Becca. Because we have here also Ilene Prusher. Ilene is going to talk to us a little bit about what her view from America, from Florida, as part of the American Jewish progressive Zionist community. Ilene Prusher is an award-winning journalist, an author, and lecturer, and she joined the staff of Florida Atlantic University after nearly 2 decades abroad, including living in Israel. She's the founder and digital director of MediaLab at FAU, Florida Atlantic University. And she's here, and an author, and she's here to share the perspective from the other side of the Atlantic. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ilana, and thanks for having me today. It's a good question. One time you wonder for yourself, what do I represent in terms of the American Jewish community? And I noticed that I'm the one person, of your panelists who's not in Israel. It's kind of like just a heartbreak story in a way, because I miss Israel a lot. And yet a lot of the things that were happening in Israel before October 7th, leading up to the, attempt to kind of overturn democracy as we know it, were things that were worrying to us. When I say us, I mean as a couple and as a family. I'll say by way of introduction, yes, I spent about 20 years abroad, and about 15 of them were in Israel. It's interesting. This probably wasn't by design, but Becca was just saying that she came from a more reform background, and you and Judy, who I know and is a former colleague at Haaretz, from the modern Orthodox world. I grew up conservative, so we've covered all our bases here, but not super religious. Although my dad went to Israel after the Camp David Accords were signed, and he helped implement plans to build air bases in the Negev to boost Israel's security. So when he passed away a little over a year ago, a couple of weeks after October 7th, I felt very proud of that. My mom grew up going to Habonim, so very much like labor Zionist background. So I think those, that a little bit informed who I became. But I actually think journalism was really what educated me and shifted, the standard Zionism that I got when I went to Tel Aviv University as an undergrad. And I think things start to shift for me, really, quite honestly, when I had the privilege of seeing things in person, which I did as a journalist not long after the Oslo Accords were signed. I'm close to in age to you, Ilana, so I got to spend about half of the 90s covering, the attempt at, I think some of us thought it was heading towards a 2-state solution. Not everybody obviously believed in that. And the Accords were sadly not very specific about where they were leading. So I got to cover that whole segment. Left, to cover other parts of the Middle East, and then came back in 2005 and spent the next 10, 11 years until I came here to Florida, and that's nearly 10 years ago. And I have to say, it's not been easy being someone who, still, loves Israel and yet is highly critical both of Israeli policy or the Israeli government. And, I'm thinking of some of the anecdotes that you shared both in the book and some of the panelists have shared that were so moving. And I think of a time, I think it was, this was around 2018 when I was already here for a couple of years. And if you guys can remember that time when there was a day of rage and a lot of Palestinians tried to rush the fence with Gaza, and about 60 people were killed in a day. And I wrote, and I was just looking them up now. I wrote some things in Haaretz. I wrote some things in Time magazine that was saying, could Israel have used water cannons to repel people? Not that their water cannons are great, but they don't kill people the way that live fire does. And I got so much criticism in my community here in South Florida. I live in Boca Raton now, and my husband teaches at a Jewish day school. And one comment that really stayed with me, one was someone saying well, I'm a real Zionist. I really care about Israel, and I think, well, are you citizens? Have you lived there? Have you served there? And I didn't say all of that, but it's painful, and I feel like being just part of this call is like being in good company with like minds that are inquisitive and basically wanting to bring about a better day. And even like using the word occupation, which would roll off my tongue every day when I lived in Israel, I use carefully around here, and I'm careful in whose company I use it, because I don't necessarily want to end up in political fights with people in the same place that I like to daven on Shabbat. But I'm thinking of a conversation we had a bunch of Jewish friends on New Year's Eve this year, just over a month ago. And one person was saying, it's still the most moral army in the world. And a friend and I were like, I'm not so sure that's really true. I don't know. Most armies are not moral. They're there. What they do is they're fighting, they're defending, they're doing a lot of killing. And, and I don't know about, that. And I felt like one of the things, let's circle back to your book more than talking about myself, that, really speaks to me, is, the fact that in this book that you did, as you said in the beginning, you preferred in the past. And I read some of your other books. I remember when your book about the war on women in Israel came out, I loved, the way that you took on some of the issues there. And in this book, I think that you do a really wonderful job of weaving in the personal and the political, and also, speaking in a very current way about how difficult it is. And I just really felt for you when you were, you told the story in the beginning, you tell in the book when you're kind of like, why don't you leave this, why don't you go back to being a grandma? I've had my share of it, and it's really hard. And sometimes you just want to put your head under the covers and just talk with the people who agree with you. But we have to keep getting out there and speaking our truth. And I know I see some of the names on this call, like Joanna Chen and Ruth Ebenstein, and people I know who are doing that on a daily basis. So I think that's really very important. I love the part of your book, I have to say, where you talk about this essay that you wrote in Lilith in 2014 called My Political Evolution. I didn't know about that essay, but now I'm going to go read it. But it's around that time too. I remember I was still living in Israel when that war happened in 2014. And I wrote a piece actually for Haaretz that had a headline that was something along the lines, in Israel or Gaza declaring sympathy for the other side as a no-go zone. And all I had done was put up a post about how I had run to a shelter with my then 2 small babies. And it went through my mind, a mother in Gaza has no shelter to run to. And people were like, outraged with that. So it's really hard to hold on to your empathy. And yet I believe we have to keep doing it, and we have to challenge others to do it. I want to draw attention to everyone who's here to celebrate your book today to something that really spoke to me, because it's both relevant for what's happening in Israel and in America. As I was preparing for this call, I just saw that President Trump withdrew temporary protected status for 300,000 Venezuelans. And I had this kind of like moment of, she's still trying to absorb all the radical change that's happening here. And this is what you wrote on page 41. But what do we do when the experience or the narrative we so desperately want to embrace is something of a lie? Well, we know what people generally do. They tend to stick to what's comfortable and ignore the rest. If we ever had doubts about the human psyche's ability to ignore facts and reality because people are attached to something being shown to them, we only need to look at America since 2016. Our minds are apparently ready to hang on to some awful ideas by ignoring the worst, as long as those ideas feed some kind of deep need. Am I shocked by this cognitive dissonance? I don't know. We've lived it for a long time. I guess I want to throw in is that, one of the struggles right now is sort of, when you're kind of presenting, the need to get back to, some kind of, well, first we need for hostages to come home and but thank God we're at least at a ceasefire now. But, will the ceasefire stick? Is the intention to, for Israel to resettle parts of Gaza? Are there potential solutions? People ask me this regularly. So I'm so glad that your book details some of them in part 3. So I'm going to actually recommend it to a few people who have been asking me, because I think people in the American Jewish community are, living, with the thought of what happened on October 7th, could happen again. People weren't, and it's weird, but there is some research that shows that even watching videos of it can be traumatizing for people who didn't live through it. And I think they look at that and they think, there's no hope. So we have to just keep fighting. And I see my community in South Florida bringing in speakers, who often give out that message. There's no point in negotiating or thinking that that's going to happen. I like to hold on to a little bit of optimism and believe that there is, and feel like my work as a journalist over the years, spending so much time in the West Bank and Gaza, makes me think that vast majority of Palestinians would not have chosen this war and don't really want Hamas. But some polls sometimes show otherwise. When I was on a trip back to Israel in May, I had a Palestinian friend who said, well, I don't like Hamas, but we all support the resistance. And I was still like stewing on that for months later, trying to figure out what does that mean for her? What does it mean to me? How are we going to move forward with this? I'm so glad for your book, and I think it's important. I know there's some people today who maybe have read it, and probably some who haven't. But we all need to read it, and maybe even get some book groups together to discuss it. Maybe whether here in America, in Israel, across different communities. Possibly to be, help us have the conversation about where we're going to go from this, and how, can we have somebody, I would love someone like a Becca, to come and speak at my community, and not always someone who basically says, I have no space for worrying about the other side right now. I'm still on October 7th. I mean, that was literally what someone who's my husband's supervisor at the day school told him, a month or two ago, when he was trying to introduce students who are high school seniors to different narratives. I don't have space for it. We need to make the space. We need to make the space to have the conversation and to be aware of the humanity of the other side. So Elana, mazel tov on this amazing work that you've done.
Thank you
for inviting me to this conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding me, by the way, that we've known each other for a while. Because in 2014, while you were working at TLV1, we did a radio program about the war on women in Israel. So first of all, thank you for that. And also thank you for reminding me how many amazing people are on this call. Wow. Leah Lax is here also, and Ruth Evanstein, and my friend Jessica is here. And yeah, lots of hi to all of you. Really, I'm really honored that you're all here. I also want to, before we wrap up, I also want to give a shout out to my husband, Jacob, who is doing the tech side tonight. Shani Bob, who usually helps me with the tech side, is doing on baby duty right now, and my husband stepped in. We've been together for 37 years. I just want to tell you, 37 years we've been together, and we've been through a lot of these changes together. So he gets a huge shout out for rolling with the punches with me. I just want to put that there. Anyway, I did want to comment about what you said, Eileen, about empathy, because I feel like what you touched on, what feels to me to be the core issue here. The core issue has to do with whether or not we're taught, whether or not we're capable of seeing people through a human lens, even if they're different from us, right? Even if they're from a radically different background, culture, upbringing, whatever, different religion, different language. Can we can we feel empathy? And I feel like the world that we're living in, this like Trumpy world that we're living in, has legitimized not doing it. It has totally legitimized the idea that if someone is not like you, you are allowed to wish them unwell. You're allowed to want to control them. You're allowed to not care if they die, effectively. You know, and we see that like in a zillion ways, whether it's kids in cages or women having reproductive rights or whatever. So this issue with Palestinians in Gaza is like almost one more of many iterations of that lack of empathy.